All right, let's start to see some code with interacting with core data. So the first thing you need to do is we're going to start off in our feeds table view controller, because this is where ultimately most of the interaction with core data is going to be. Now, regardless of where that is, you're going to have to request the functionality of core data. In order to do that, we're going to have to add an import statement. So we're going to come out to the top of our file, and we're going to import core data. Now, simply by doing that, we're going to get access to all of the nice little features of core data within our class here. So I'm going to come down a little bit, and I'm actually going to save you a little bit of pain of watching me type all this out. And I'm going to paste in a few bits of code here, and I'm going to walk you through them. That's going to show you the basic interaction between being able to insert some data into core data and getting it out. So I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to paste a couple helper methods here. All right, so I've pasted in three methods here, or three functions: save feed, feed exists, and get feeds. Now, if you take a look at this, they're fairly straightforward, and actually some of the functionality is actually very similar, but just so you can see the pattern of how this is going to work. Now, save feed is what we're going to use to actually persist one of our feeds and its associated articles. So we're going to pass in our feed model. We're first going to check to see if the feed already exists there, because there's really no sense in adding in duplicates if we don't have to. Then these next two steps are going to be very redundant over and over again whenever you're dealing with core data. Now, if you recall in a previous lesson, I pointed you into the app delegate, and you saw all this extra code down at the bottom about the core data stack, dealing with the directory, the managed object model, the persistent store coordinator, and the managed object context. Now, you can definitely pick through here and see how these things work. I'm not really too concerned about it for this lesson, since we're just looking to get the basics down. But one of the most important parts that you're going to be interacting with throughout this application is the managed object context. So if we come back into our feeds table view controller, the first two steps that we always have to do is we have to get access to our app delegate, since that's where all of this stuff has been created for us when we checked that little use core data box when we were creating our project. So to do that, we're using a special UI application class, which has a shared application method on it and has a delegate property, and we can cast that as our app delegate. And we're casting that as our app delegate because that's ultimately the name of our class. Then we're going to use that app delegate to get our managed object context, which is merely a property that was actually created for us so we can use it. Now, later on in our application, all we have to do is use this managed object context that's ultimately going to get data in and out of core data. So now the basic process here, when we want to save something into our core data managed object context, is we're going to always create an entity. And the way that you do that is by using the NSEntity description class, and we want to create an entity for name. This is where we're going to specify what the entity name is, and we want to specify in which managed object context. So that ultimately means you can have multiple contexts within your application should you so choose. So that's going to create an entity for us, and then ultimately we want this to be a feed. That's why I created those entity classes or subclasses in the last lesson. So I'm going to create a new NS managed object for the entity that we just created within core data, and we want to make sure that it is inserted into our managed context, and we want to cast this as a feed. So everywhere else within my application, or at least within this method, I can refer to this as feed, and it has all the properties you would assume of a feed to have from that class: a title, a URL, and ultimately articles. So all we're going to do is we're going to set the properties of this entity to the properties that match the model. Then we're going to create a mutable set here of articles, which is just a set, an NS set, if you're familiar with that within iOS, to hold a collection of information. Immutable just means I can add data to it. So then for each of the article models, so this is just a simple for in loop, for each of the article models, I'm going to loop through them, and for each one of them, I'm going to create a corresponding entity as an article entity, just like I did up above. I'm going to do the same thing here for creating an entity, then cast an entity into an article, set its appropriate properties, add it to my collection of articles here. And once I've looped through all of them, I'm going to make sure that I assign those articles to my feed entity, and then I'm going to call save on my managed context. Now, this is just a little process here. You can create an error variable and then call save and pass that in. And if something bad happens, then we get that information in the error, and then I go ahead and just print that out to the console at the bottom of the screen. Hopefully we won't need to use that, but just in case we can do some troubleshooting. So that is the save feed. Now, feed exists is going to do the same thing. It's going to get our app delegate, it's going to get our managed context, and then it's going to do a retrieval. Now, retrievals are a little bit different. You're going to deal with something called a fetch request. Now, a fetch request is just another class, and in this case, we're going to create a fetch request based on an entity with the name of feed. So I want to look for feeds within core data via this fetch request. Now, you can leave it just like that, and if you were to execute a fetch request with only this, it's going to basically do a select all. It's going to give you all the feeds that it finds within our persisted store. But I don't want all of them. I want to make sure that the one that I'm trying to save doesn't already exist, and basically the uniqueness of this is going to be based on the URL. So I'm going to create what's called an NS predicate, which you can kind of equate to maybe a where clause if you really wanted to. It's kind of working in a similar way. So it's going to look for any feed in there which has a URL property that's equal to the URL that's being passed in as a parameter to our function. And then we're going to set that predicate on the fetch request, and then we're just going to execute this fetch request, and we're going to have that same kind of whole NS error situation going on. And then we simply look to see if there's more than 0 results on my results, and if there is, then that means it already exists, and if there's not, then we're going to return false, which means it doesn't exist. And then finally, we have get feeds, which is going to do something very, very similar to what we have here in exist, except it's going to return an array of feed models. So how is it going to return feed models if it's having the feed entities stored within core data? Well, I'm going to have to do a little massaging of the data. And this is where you might think about things like factory patterns and things like that. If you really want to, I'm just kind of keeping it relatively simple, but you could get as elaborate as you'd like. So once again, I need my app delegate and my managed context. I'm going to create my fetch request that's looking for the entity name of feed. And then I'm going to execute that fetch request. And then once I get those back, I'm going to loop through all of my results, and I'm going to make sure that I'm casting those as an array of feeds because I want to deal with those objects that I've created, those subclasses. I don't want to deal with the NS managed object and have to do some helper methods to go through and set and get all these properties. So I'm going to, for each one of the results, I'm going to create a new model. I'm going to set the appropriate properties. I'm going to loop through all the articles as well, create articles for each one of those. I'm going to assign those article models to my feed model. And then ultimately, once we get down to the bottom, I'm going to return all of those models. So those are going to be the 3 basic helper methods that we're going to use throughout the rest of our application. We're going to have to add in some tweaks here and there as we start getting into things like updating and deleting. But for the most part, that's going to be enough for us to get started. So now that we have these helper methods in there, let's go ahead and put them to use by interacting from the UI down to core data.